So I drove while she nosed the folds of my sweatshirt on the bench seat of the Chevy and fell in love with my smell of ice rinks and rubber through my heart belonged to other beloveds, stanchions of high voltage lines and the stalled horizon, or something as simple as a sparse line of gulls gliding over the winter lake. My personal philosophy is a second story porch, bee eaten beams, wobbly and rotted, corners filled with the day's leavings. I liked Bach for a time, and she my soft hands, and I her sun-bleached Cleveland beginnings. But the sepia pictures and the and not the life, how their color reminded me of old photos of ball players from the early 20th century. And I like more the skateboarder clearing leaves from the avenue's cluttered gutters and the street psychic stating the obvious. It's November, and we could all use some luck. So we hit Milwaukee, and why? Why not? The art museum was startling, churchwood and folk art, and the cracked expanse of lake ice through the windows. So she liked my mind or kind eyelashes and bulldozed my back as I fumbled to say something pretty to bridge the distance. And we bowled in a basement alley, and we got loaded and sober and saw the wind carry a leaf like a hand, stem down, brown palm open, and twirling like a waiter carrying a tray brimming with champagne flutes. It would take us to Detroit, Chicago, the spread Midwest, the sun setting where it always does, Iowa before winter's end, where we felt the cold come down through the hours to a moment fluttered open like a shuffled deck, taillights on the highway in pattern brigade, smoke bolstered through the idling pipes, her wondering who I loved, the horseshoe shadow of my arms proclaiming this, all this. The Life, a poem in the collection of poems of our guest tonight, Grady Chambers, the North American Stadium. Good evening. My name is Charles Carr, and welcome to Philly Loves Poetry, a collaboration between the Moonstone Art Center of Philadelphia and PhillyCAM. The focus of our program is to give our listeners and our viewers the experience of the very rich culture of poetry in the city of Philadelphia and the surrounding areas. And tonight we have a wonderful, we can claim him now, local poet, Grady Chambers. Grady is the author of the novel Great Disasters, forthcoming. I don't know if it's out yet.
Not yet. September 30th for all you viewers out there.
Okay. Forthcoming in September of this year, and it's published by Tin House Books. And his poetry collection, which I just mentioned, North American Stadiums, which is published by Milkweed Books in 2018. Grady and this book of poems was selected by Henry Cole as the winner of the Max Ritvo Poetry Prize. Grady's poems and stories can be found in The Atlantic, the Paris Review, the American Poetry Review, Plowshares, Poetry Magazine, The Sun, Joyland, Image, the Kenyon Review, and elsewhere. Grady is a former Wallace Stegner Fellow. He attended the MFA program at Syracuse, and now he lives and works in the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia. So welcome, Grady. I just wanted to kind of let our viewers know, well, how did I find Grady Chambers? I guess like I find a lot of poems, I stumble over a poem. But in this instance, one of Grady's poems was offered as a prompt in a workshop I attend and the workshop is run by wonderful local poet Leonard Gontarek. And I think the poem was actually in the poetry, the magazine Poetry. I think it was Starlight Boulevard. I'm not sure. Indeed. I know that appeared there.
Indeed.
But not only myself, but other people really came to love that poem. And one of my colleagues in the workshop indicated that she has been reading and following more of your poetry since that time.
So gratifying to hear.
Yeah. So that's really wonderful. So I wanted to start just by talking about the title of your book called North American Stadium. I guess before I opened the book, I said, well, Charles, you're a sports guy, especially baseball. I wonder if this, and I know it does have some baseball. I mean, you have Forbes Field in there. I've been there in the 60s. But I also, when I stepped back and after I read your book of poems, I said, I think it is a very good title.
I am very happy to hear that.
Yeah.
People bring up the title with me not infrequently, and oftentimes with some curiosity about why I chose to give that title to the book, because people seem to find some incongruity sometimes between the title and the poems in the book. So I'm glad you like it.
Yeah. It's a very. Let me say, well, why did you feel that stadium fit? I guess after I think of stadiums and the panorama of stadiums and everything that happens in stadiums, more than just baseball and football games, but so much else that draws your eyes all over the place. I really have that feeling in this book of poems that is so very expansive, the ground that you cover in this book. Interesting also, and I think I told you when we talked, that there were some, as I was reading along, there were poems that I was reading, and immediately one of my favorite poets, American poets, Philip Levine, came to mind, especially after I read Another Beauty Remembered. And I won't really get into deeper, but what it reminded me of is that Levine, lived in Detroit, and he had many poems about people that worked in the audio industry. I think he worked himself for, some time. And that poem struck me, but as I read further, and what I talked about, the expansiveness, I also thought of Walt Whitman. I really did. But the last stop, and I haven't thought of this author for many, many, many years, and that's Marcel Proust. And, particularly his book In Search of Lost Time. And I said to myself, it's just this thing about the invocation of memory, these objects and places that invoke our memory. And is our memory reliable enough? And how does our memory change as we move forward? So I just wanted to, throw that out there as far as influences and things I really saw and enjoyed in that book of poems.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's funny when this book was published in 2018, and the bulk of my writing in recent years has been towards writing this novel that is going to be published in September, and also continuing to write poems. But I really haven't been in the world of this book for a few years now, and when I've had opportunities to do readings, I've mostly taken the opportunity to read from newer work. But so the last couple weeks ahead of appearing on the segment tonight has been really interesting because it's sort of brought me back to the book. And one thing in returning to the poems that was so interesting to me is that I can discern the influences so clearly, and it took me right back to the years that I was, really working on this book, which that most of the poems come from between the years of, I would say, 2012 and 2016. But from poem to poem, I can almost remember sort of what poets I was really absorbed in reading, who definitely bear a stamp on the poems in this book. And Philip Levine is, a poet whom I deeply love, and remember, a bunch of these poems came from when I was in the graduate program in creative writing at Syracuse University, and Levine's collection, What Work Is, was essentially like a Bible for me. I mean, I was reading it constantly. So I think his poems have a real stamp on this book. And I think also in thinking about some of the influences, there are two poets from a long time ago who, when I look back at these poems, I really see their stamp, and that's Gerard Manley Hopkins is one of them, and who else did I have in mind? Dylan Thomas, and mostly in the sense that I remember while I was at Syracuse and while I was working on these poems, I was enamored with the poems of Hopkins and Dylan Thomas, in part because of the kind of rhythmic propulsion that they're able to imbue their poems with. And I think, if you read any Dylan Thomas poem out loud, I mean, one of the enormous pleasures of his poems is just the way that the language sounds, the sounds of the words, the syntax of the lines. They have a real propulsion. And that is definitely something that I was thinking about a lot when I was working on these poems. And I think there's a section in this book, I can't actually remember in this moment whether it's the second or third section, where the poems are actually much more prosaic. They sort of slow down a little bit. Reading them out loud, it probably sounds about as close to prose as you're going to find in poetry. So that's a bit of an exception. But with the bulk of the sections of this book, I was trying to write poems that were intended to as much be heard as they were to be read. And I think Levine, Whitman, Allen Ginsberg, and then Hopkins and Dylan Thomas, as I've mentioned, their work really had a stamp on the poems that went into this book.
Yeah, your poems are very enjoyable to read. That's all out loud. That's a big litmus test. I do a lot of sitting there and going back to certain poems, not only your anybody's collection, and reading them aloud, and that's kind of a test for me. So you talk about this collection, and you have 4 parts to the book. Why is that? Well, I mean, why did you want to do it that way? What do you feel it accomplishes for the reader?
On a very practical level, it felt important to me to have sections in the book, primarily just to give the reader a space to breathe and a space to rest. Reading collections of poetry, I mean, one beautiful thing about, a poetry collection is that many of them can be read if one wants in one sitting, but sort of invariably as a reader, even if there are no distinct section breaks in a book of poems, I find myself after sort of, 20 pages, 25 maybe, invariably putting the book down, just because for a lot of writers, every individual poem is inviting you into a separate world from the rest of the poems in the book. And as a reader, you have to get reestablished with the context of that poem, the story of that poem. And doing that, if you do that for 85 pages of poems in one sitting, it's taxing. So on a very practical level, I just wanted to give readers a space to naturally put the book down, and be able to feel like there was a natural resting place in the book for that. And And I think the other reason, in thinking about why I ordered these sections as I did, I remember at the time of putting the book together that in thinking about what should go into the first section, I wanted the poems that went into that section to establish, to sort of touch on a number of themes that would be returned to in poems later in the book. But essentially, I wanted to use that first section to sort of put all the thematic balls up in the air, so to speak, so that a reader would sort of have a sense of my general concerns and ethos as a writer, but also as they move deeper into the book, there are characters that recur. There are sort of types of poems that recur, one of which, as surely you noticed, so many of these poems feature a speaker who is in a car moving through, an American landscape. Mm-hmm. And so I tried to sort of space those out throughout the book, and also sort of have some characters recur across the sections of the book so that by the time one, comes to the end of the book, in an ideal world, they would come away feeling like the book as a whole tells a kind of story, not just the individual poems telling the individual story that each of those poems has to tell.
Well, I think you accomplish that. I mean, it's interesting that you say, in the car, because if the reader allows himself, you feel that you're in a passenger seat, and you're driving them. And we're not telling you to slow down.
I wish I could take what you just said and add it as a blurb on the back of the book. That would be a great introduction to this book.
I really had that sense, and I find exciting because of, as I said, the expanse. I mean, we're dealing with Chicago, Milwaukee, upstate New York, and God knows where else in this book.
Sure.
And I like the idea that your explanation. I want people maybe to pause, and I saw in the pause in these sections a slightly different approach to your writing a poem. Right, you said in section 3, they tend to be almost like prose poems, but not long, well, not overly long poems, and I think that's great for the reader to see different styles that like the artist takes, and can they accomplish that in with that style?
Absolutely, and just looking back at the table of contents, I'm realizing it's the second section of the book that has these sort of 5 or 6 in a row, I think, quite long poems. Each one probably coming out to somewhere between 2 and 4 pages. And to your point, that's exactly what I wanted to do, was for the section break also to allow for a kind of reset. And for the second section, I think they're fundamentally a different kind of poem than the poems that are in the first section. And that break in between allows for like a kind of palate cleansing. To use the best phrase at my disposal, but I'm also it's you talk about the sort of different geographies of the book. And another interesting facet of really returning to these poems over the last couple of weeks has been that that sort of geographic journey that the book takes so closely mirrors the different geographies that I was in the years that I was writing those poems. Mm-hmm. So I had been living in Chicago. I grew up in Chicago, and was living there from 2010 to 2012. Then moved to Syracuse, New York from 2012 to 2015 for the years of the graduate program. And then after the program ended, I moved to Oakland, California, because I had been awarded a 2-year Stegner Fellowship through Stanford University. Mm-hmm. So I was out there for a couple of years in a weekly writing workshop, and just so you can sort of trace that geographic arc through the poems. But that second section is really stands out to me in memory because uh, so many of those poems I distinctly remember writing when I was living in Oakland. And those poems bear so much the stamp of one of my teachers out there, who was Louise Glick. And it was just, I mean, just one of the great blessings of my life to be able to study with her for 2 years. But, one of the things that she told me, which I think had a tremendous influence on my writing generally, but particularly in the poems in that second section, is I would bring her a poem, and we'd sit at her coffee table, and she'd read it. She'd be like, I don't really think this is working entirely as is. What I would like you to do is, over the next week, um, don't worry so much how the poem hangs together, but write 6 to 10 more pages towards this poem. Just keep pushing it forward. Bring those pages, no matter how long it gets, back to me. And I think that you'll find that by simply, continuing to push the story that you're telling forward, you will find there what you need. And I think that's it's just a very sort of cause and effect reason why I think the poems that I was writing when I was out in California and that made their way into the second section of the book got so much longer and got so much more closer to prose in the way that they speak, because I think she, in her advice, she allowed me to move away from the hyper-attention that I had previously had to rhythm and to sound, and sort of said, trust yourself that music will come into the poems, but spend more time telling the story that you want to tell.
I happened in my research happened upon an interview that you gave, and I'm quoting it. It says, and this is you, I almost never set out with a metaphorical intention when it comes to the images I am using in a poem. I want images to be what they are. And then Christopher Walkens in the journal Media mentions this also, how a brilliant poem by Grady Chambers reminded me that a train is just a train as lights in the rain. So can you talk about this? And it's interesting when you happen upon this to say, yeah, that's the way there was in one poem, and I think I discussed it with you, it's called The Window. And I absolutely love that poem.
Thank you.
It's a longer poem, but it really holds the reader. And I think it says to people, if they're, that are not, let's say, into poetry, oh, geez, you can write a poem just by this level of observation, from your window. I don't know whether it was Oakland or where it was. Can you talk about, kind of speak to this, this quote that I offered?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I do, as I'm sort of, I believe, quoted as saying in that interview, I do want the image to be simply what it is. But I think that I went on to say that my feeling, and I think this is intimately related to my process of writing poems, is that the images, if you pay close attention to the world around you, or to memory, that the images you give the images a space to accrue a kind of metaphorical resonance, but I think it would be kind of a disaster to set out with trying to craft an image for with a metaphor in mind. I think that would be a disaster for me, because that would add a kind of level of complexity to the writing itself that I think I would find profoundly unhelpful. And if I was like, okay, well, I have to figure out how to I have this image of a train crossing a bridge. I have to figure out now how to build a poem around that in such a way that it is going to attain metaphorical resonance. Like I don't think I would know how to do that, and I don't think I would do that well. But I'm remembering there's a poem that I wrote over the last couple of years, and I think it was the poem that that particular interview was talking to me about. And the poem it's a long sort of prose-ish poem, and the speaker is sort of looking back on a time in his life when. And this is true to my own life. My mother was diagnosed with cancer in 2019, and was living in Chicago. So I would try every few months to drive back from Philadelphia to Chicago, to just be there and spend time with my parents. But I was thinking about when I was working on this particular poem, I was thinking about those journeys back and forth, and and what was going on in my life at that point. And I remember sort of in the spring of that year, I went to Home Depot and bought a bunch of like flowers for the flower boxes where I live and seeds, and I was sort of trying to just get these plants and flowers to grow in my home. And as I was like, something about that needs to be in the poem. So I just sort of wrote that as it was true to my memory. And over the course of the poem, that action of planting the flowers and trying to sort of to will them into life, given the context of the poem, came on to take metaphorical resonance, but I certainly did not set out for that. So I think when I write, as you and I have talked about, this poem is full of memories, and sort of an older speaker looking back at things from childhood, or places visited. I think what I try and do is just pay very close attention to occurrences or places that continue to live very strongly in memory, and sort of trust that in revisiting them and sort of circling around them in writing that something will emerge.
When people pick up a book like this and look at the collection, I don't know what people think. I mean, in terms of how did this poet decide, how did this book come to be? How does a book of poems, it is a stretch of a series of poems written over a longer period of time, and the poet's finally says, I think I have enough for. Whereas, do people think, and some people say, well, I have a project in mind, and this is the project, and I'm going to build the poems around this particular concept. Can you talk about the process that you used to gather and to create this book of poems?
Yeah, absolutely. So with this book, the poems were, as I mentioned, primarily written between 2012 and 2016, 2017. And sometime in 2016, I think I sort of was looking at the folder on my computer with all the drafts of poems that I had written over the last handful of years, and I did sort of start where I think many people do, just looking at that quantity of poems. I sort of said, well, I should print all these out, read them start to finish, and just sort of see what's there. And that process was my starting point. And what ended up happening in the course of sort of reading back through that, at that point it was probably like 130, 140 pages of poems. Reading back through all of them at once allowed me to see sort of thematic continuities between that mass of poems, and also to begin to discern a broader narrative arc. That sort of gave me hope that, like, okay, I see a kind of story that is being told across the span of this mass of pages of poems, and my process from there was to start to sort of winnow down that pile of poems to the pieces that I thought were all kind of adding to either a thematic arc or a narrative arc that I hope the finished product of the book would tell. And so that landed me with a sort of first draft of what ended up being published as North American Stadiums. But certainly between, I think, 2016 and January 2018, when I found out this book was going to be published, as I continued to write, I sort of would slide in poems that felt like they were sort of contributing to the mood and thematic continuity that I was trying to create, and likewise took poems out.
Well, the critical acclaim that this book has received, you you succeeded. And very strong, very positive, uh, reviews of your book. And so as I said in the opening remarks, I strongly recommend. This is a fine book of poems to read for anybody. Sometimes people say, "Well, I don't get poetry."
Sure.
Okay, and there's a lot of poetry that is written these days that I understand that that reaction. I would not say this about this. This is a really strong. This is a real American book of poets collection. I think it's terrific. I think you just have enough, not too much. So I think you've really succeeded, and so I think you're going to succeed now. We've kind of hit that magical time in the program where I turn it over to you to share your poems, to read your poems, uh, you know, with our audience.
Wonderful. That sounds great. Thank you. Thank you, Charles. Um, so I think I'll start tonight by reading a handful of poems from North American Stadiums. And the first poem that I'm going to read exists as a kind of, it's like a little prayer that begins the book. And it's called Explaining the Resurrection in Simple Words. A blessing can be the act of invoking divine protection, or a favor or gift bestowed by God, and I don't know how to define mercy. But the field is lit like the heart of the night, gnats flitting above the cross-hatched grass, huge shadows of the ball players in stadium light whistling in signals from the outfield. The wind lifts and settles our shirts against our skin, and you ask after my day. There'd been pinwheels spinning on a rain-soaked lawn, pigeons cooing and nesting in the gutters. I'd pressed my back to the dark, damp wood of the trunk. Yellow flowers fell on me. This next poem I'm going to read is called Another Beauty I Remember. And this is one that Charles and I were talking about, and sort of looking back on it, I so clearly remember spending a lot of time with Philip Levine's work, and I think it definitely bears that stamp. And also, what Charles was saying about the way that that distance and memory are a part of these poems. The sort of starting point of the poem was a memory for me of the U.S. Steel factory in South Chicago, which held a real sort of fascination in my imagination when I was younger. And I think the poem both celebrates that and then goes on to occupy a different perspective of an older speaker looking back and sort of examining the glorification of a younger speaker in looking at that factory. So, Another Beauty I Remember. Somewhere in South Chicago, the millwrights and welders of U.S. Steel are leaving their masks to hooks and lockers and shining out into evening still covered in dust. Those men do not belong to me, their world of arc and fire, but many nights I have loved them. When I was 17, my friends and I rode each weekend toward the Indiana border. One drove, another worked the dials on the radio, and I drank gin in the back and ordered us to slow over the toll bridge to peer down at the barge lights roaming the Calumet River, then up to where the smokestacks of U.S. Steel rose like an organ in a church. Gin, fire, the workers coming off their shifts, light lighting up the metal dust spread along their shoulders like the men had all walked through plate glass windows. Their dust does not belong to me, but many nights I have loved them. They do not live where I was born, north of the mammoth glass residences of the Gold Coast, where the worst news was soon mended. A neighbor girl's bone broken in a fall, a garage fire sullying the air over Broadway and Balmoral. I did not know their sons. The Burns, the Walshes, the Manseckis of Bridgeport and Fuller Park, the Green Parade and the Green River and the pride of the Irish. Laughter, bright balloons over cracked asphalt, yellow hair in sunlight, all the families singing songs of another country. I keep taking the long road back to that summer because the image won't leave me. Weekend evenings, gin and driving south, smoke blasting from the factory stacks, the men glancing up at the flash of our passing. We were going to spend all night drinking gin on an Indiana beach. Dust had settled like fragments of a hand grenade, like silver wings across the backs of the men. We were going to tell each other what was beautiful. The dark water was beautiful, the fire drowning the air with smoke, our voices drowned by the sound. I stood at the edge of the water where the coastline stretched from my left and curved enough north that the stitch of factory lights looked like they were shining from the far side of the lake. We burned traces into the air with the burning tips of sticks poked into the heart of fire. We all said the sky was beautiful, our bodies light against the water. Somewhere in South Chicago, the millwrights and welders of U.S. Steel are leaving their masks to hooks, and they are going home. What did I know then? What did I know of the beauty of the men? Driving past, I watched just long enough to see them stepping out of their shifts, believing them angelic, knowing not a thing about their lives. Each of them, perhaps, seeing what I saw. Light coming off the backs of the others as they drifted into the lot, but knowing the light I saw was dust, not wings, and, knowing to call it dust, calling it dust. I was speaking about how in writing the poems of this book, I was paying so much attention to the sonic qualities of the poems, and really laboring to try and imbue many of the poems with a kind of rhythmic momentum. And I think this next poem that I'm going to read sort of really embodies that. It was never published outside this collection, which is interesting to me, and I think sort of speaks to the ways in which that it's a poem that I think functions even better being heard than it does perhaps on the page. So it's called Dispatch Pittsburgh. And I shared the poem with a friend who said, you've basically written a version of of the Rolling Stones song, Sympathy for the Devil. And what he meant by that is that this poem sort of features a narrator who kind of moves through time and is kind of devilish and irreverent. But along the way, it sort of tries to capture something about Pittsburgh. Dispatch Pittsburgh. It's 1770 or 1946 or 2018 in Iron City, Steel City, city of coal smoke and bridges, the tongue-twisting Monongahela shifting the narrative. There was Indian dominion over the upper Ohio Valley, Sawconk and Logstown, outposts of the Iroquois and Shawnee. There was a vision and a battle, vicious histories, the red oval of my mouth as I floated over tribal chiefs receiving blankets from the Europeans, a scream that no one heard. I sleep on couches and turn my body to face the cushions and keep my shoes laced and gaping on the floorboards below me. So when I wake, I step straight into daylight in the city of 500 bridges and cross number 76 into 1812 to watch the smokestacks and forges spring up on the flatlands, a city formed by warfare. They called it the Westward Portal until destiny manifested itself, and it became the smoky city, the typhoid capital, blooms forming from the hot rolling of ingot stock, iron ore crushed in the sinter plants, the deposits roiling the rivers to 130 degrees. In divine time, I stood with Carnegie on the gilded balcony of his East Side mansion. We toasted Clinton and Soho, whose iron furnaces brought coke fire smelting to the region. And I danced at the Battery Ball with Rockefeller's daughter. We cakewalked into a two-step, polkaed into a waltz, and I left her mid-mazurka to blitz the buffet table. I came back in 65 years to find her a skeleton frozen in a permanent twirl, her pearls glowing brightly in the ballroom lights, and I drank the glass of champagne still bubbling in her hand. But there was no time to waste. It was 1944. There was a war on. So I snatched the pearls from her neck and loaded them into my Colt Commando and marched out into the arsenal of democracy. I high-stepped to the Navy yards where tan sailors leaned out of the portholes while their girls knelt with bent necks. It looked like praying. And I cheered the men's departure while their sisters wept into my shoulders, and I jeweled the night sky with my gunshots. Then I walked across the Liberty Bridge and felt the factories chip and crumble behind me. And when I reached the other side, it was 1973. My gun had rusted, and I slid across beds of shattered glass, chanting white flight, rust belt, brain drain, mercy, and knifed into the bottom of a fountain where the Allegheny joins the Monongahela, and I closed my eyes and slept for 50 years. When I woke, I was surrounded by dimes and pennies. It was 2023, just another wartime Sunday. So I shrugged and played the lotto and followed the streams of people to Heinz Field, where the Steelers lined up to play the Chiefs. And I scalped tickets in the bright light of the winter parking lot. And I told anyone who would listen they used to call this city hell with the lid off. And the crowds moved around me. I hovered above them, and everyone wore yellow sweatshirts, and the arms were stitched with black hearts and stars. This next poem is called A Story About the Moon. I'd been on this road before. Last year lit with wildflowers, this year the hills stripped bare, baked by sun. It spills out of Los Angeles like a long dark tongue, then nothing for 500 miles, just dust and shadows of cattle sheds, past towns so small I turned off just to see who lives there. My uncle, long ago, on a country road he'd never been on, saw a sign for a barn beside a creek beneath some pines. An hour down the road he turned around and went back. He liked the land, he said. He bought it, then never left. I think about that sometimes. Happenstance leading to a life, one set of faces replaced by others. A girl I loved told me no one knows for certain how the moon was formed, that there was earth where now there are oceans, that a burning rock slammed into us and the displaced land became the moon. Back then, she could toss a penny from her balcony and hit my window. We lived that close. I remember one winter passing the exit peeling off toward Cleveland. She was living there with her father. By then, we hardly spoke. I thought, if I turned off, what would happen if I stopped? I think that's what I mean about happenstance. Where you are and how you came to be there. And how cold the roads looked. The ramp and the overpass and the thin metal of the exit sign. how that day I just kept going. I think if I can find it, I will read one more from North American Stadiums. This last poem from the book is called A Summer. In June, my dog died. By the sex shop on Belmont, a guy carried a sign with last days printed in fat black letters, and he could be forgiven for thinking so. The city was steaming. Commuters shook open their papers. Capitalism seemed to collapse, then didn't. Men howled from their jail cells all across the South. I wanted to feel real grief, and did, the way my mother lifted the dead dog off the vet's metal slab, then held it to her chest as if it were a child, and only sleeping. But driving home, she showed me the first house she lived in with my father. That night we cried, lit a candle, drank cold white wine on the dark back porch. What I mean is, it felt good to sit there. It felt like I could feel time open outward like a swimmer opens water. In July, an ex-girlfriend called about a jacket she'd never given back. We made plans. By August, I'd forgotten the sign, but remembered this man standing under the flat sky, diminished, the gray traffic passing behind him. The heat broke. August kept on going. I drove my mother to the shore, scattered the dog's ashes, dove in. And so I think I will continue with some newer poems of mine. These are all part of a collection that I'm currently at work on, and that has gone through a number of iterations over the last few years. But some helpful context is sort of what I mentioned earlier. My mom was diagnosed with lung cancer in 2019, and she passed away in fall of 2023. So as I was sort of working recently on putting together this collection, the sort of third and final section of the book, I found myself putting in a number of poems about my mom's passing and that experience and the pain of that. And as I was sort of bringing that together, I came across a handful of essentially prayer poems that I had written over the last handful of years, each of them sort of direct address to God. And it seemed, for whatever reason, that the right thing to do was to kind of intermingle those poems in that section of the book. So I'll read from that final section of the book that I'm at work on. This first poem is called The Garden. When my mother could no longer walk from the kitchen to the yard, the garden became my chore. Early summer, my hair grown long, my blue sweatshirt coiled in a basket on the lawn. I stood on the wooden bench in the garden in the evenings, filling the dark soil until it swelled with water, then sank back down. What I liked best was how each thing gave to another. The leaves of a large plant shaded the blossoms of its brother. Water passed from the soaked ivy to the parched flowers in the pots below. That small garden was all one thing. The death of a single plant is a tragedy. My father swept the steps. My sister sat beside my mother. Somewhere within my mother's lung lived its cancer, glowing inside her like a coal. So as to heal it, I tried to come to it with love, as I did the rose in its black pot and the wild evergreen nodding in the spray. And as I also tried to come to God, standing before the wall of ivy, like a flower bowing in a heavy rain. Most of these poems that sort of cycle around my mom's passing just take as their title the first line of the poem. So this one is called You Lived for 78 Years, Then You Died on a Thursday. You lived for 78 years, then you died on a Thursday. It was dark. The sun hadn't even risen. I remember feeling this strange sense that we needed to hurry to depart, like a husband and a wife waking in a hotel room late on Sunday morning. It was as if suddenly the room where we said goodbye to you didn't belong to us, and never had. It was hard to slip your rings from your fingers, and hard to throw away the little pack of cookies on your bedside table, so I kept them. It was so hard to say goodbye that I came back to look at you, one final time, like someone at the last second stopping the door of a rented room from shutting, then peering back in to make certain he hasn't left anything behind. This next poem is called From the Top of the Hospital, You Could See Over the City. Excuse me. From the top of the hospital, you could see over the city to the blue of the lake, like the view of a bird or a spirit. I thought it was so beautiful when I was a child to watch the hairdressers wash the women's hair, their necks bent back like lovers in pleasure, my mother in the line among them. Because I'd been young then, I was allowed a glimpse into that world. Because I am her son, though I am older now, the nurse, while my mother slept, let me stay. I know you want to be here, but you need to sleep, my sister said as I sat by the bed, holding my mother's hand. When I closed my eyes, I saw the most beautiful colors. Women in medieval gowns, salmon, mauve, and brown. They turn on the lights, and then they strip your bedding. It took just 2 nurses to slip a sheet beneath you when you died, then lift your body into the air. You were so light. Prayer 7, I began at each day's end. I began at each day's end by looking back. It was a form of praying. Kneeling in my single room, summer's murmur coming in the windows, trying to lift before me, like things that had been drowned, the moments I'd forgotten. So much had happened. Jessica in the driveway waving goodbye, the bright cardinal calling from the tree's brown branch, though even that I wouldn't remember until I stopped in the crowd in the train station's atrium, briefly astonished that I had lost, almost forever, that cardinal's call. What a beautiful story a day is, each one a little life. Think back into your own. Didn't so much happen just today? Didn't you think of someone you missed, then let the thought of them, like a lost astronaut, fall away into the darkness? Didn't you stop as you were making coffee to see the tree across the street had already thickened with leaves, and the spring you thought was young was almost over, and the future you longed for you are already in? I noticed the morning that you died. I noticed the morning that you died, I'd put my wristwatch on upside down, so the 6 was where the 12 should be, and the 9 where the 3. It was October. The sun rose an hour after we placed the sheet over your body, but it snowed like grief the day you were buried, as if your death had changed the seasons. In January, I placed a bundle of dried lavender at the head of your grave. They said the stone would take months, so the flowers I left stood in its place, a purple flame atop the snow. By March, Sparse strands of grass began to grow on the bed of dirt, tentative and slow, like children in a classroom shyly putting up their hands. The morning you died, I righted my watch, but something strange happened with time. Even here in May, when I close my eyes, I am with you in October, your chest expanding with the breath of the oxygen mask. Still, the feeling of your hand beneath my hand stays with me, like the rain that began in April, continued into May, and still hasn't stopped. This next poem is called Prayer 5, When I Close My Eyes. When I close my eyes, I try to quiet my thoughts until my mind is blank as the space of the room. I can hear the train like a voice from very far away. I can feel the air in the room moving through. When I consider that yesterday I bowed my head in the exact same place where I am ending today, and that, Lord, if you let me, this is how I'll end tomorrow, I see the way a single day contains infinity. So many stars tonight. When I pray, I sometimes think I begin to sense something of what you want us to understand about the peace that underlies all things. Everything that we worry about may come to pass. Everything that we worry about may come to pass, but something more will come. Can I read 2 more poems?
I think we only had time for one more.
Okay, great. I will. I'll read what is right now the very last poem in the collection I'm at work on. The book is called "Wish You Were Here," and this last poem is just called "Draft." But then, of course, we're all weighed down by something. It was Steve who was speaking, but even as I listened, I was noticing the way my attention drifted back to the afternoon, where I'd sat with a friend as she stacked glasses above the kitchen sink, though all I could think about was her life as she spoke and what she'd suffered. And Steve went on to explain that we have little idea about the true lives of those who are closest to us, or the pain they might be in, magnified by the distance that emerges between the things we share and the things we keep inside. I was trying to understand, as I listened to him, this bind in which I kept finding myself, worried while I was living that I'd left behind my writing, then worried while I was writing that I'd moved too far away from life. I thought about the people I felt I'd let drift too far away from me, and whom I needed to be more present for, and that maybe the trick was that I simply needed to listen deeply to the words and to the silences of whoever was standing before me, speaking, and that if I did so, the space between us might begin to be filled with grace. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Grady. Grady Chambers. Thank you for sharing those new poems, and good luck with your book, and keep us advised when it's going to come out. But this is North American Stadiums. Surely recommend it to anybody. So I want to thank you. I also want to thank the operator helped to make this program real and live for our audience, Elisa Purinson, who's behind the camera here tonight. And I think it's her first go-round on this. She did a terrific job. So thank you, Elisa. And also, this is just one program of the Moonstone Art Center. Many more. Nearly every Wednesday evening at Fergie's Pub, we have a live reading of local poets. So I ask our audience, I've asked them before, is, support Moonstone. I don't think there's any organization in the area that does more to advance the love of poetry in the city of Philadelphia. So you can go to moonstoneartcenter.org and see how you can continue to support us. So thank you to everyone again. Thank you to PhillyCAM for doing this. And we look forward next month to seeing you again and having more poetry.